Yeah, they don't want to miss anything.
Thank you for reminding. Yes, exactly.
Thank you.
Recording.
Yeah. Van's having computer issues too, so
All right.
thanks for that.
So, but yes, we have 2 more weeks left. So there will be 1 more lecture today, and there will be 1 more in 2. I mean, 1 today and 1 more in 2 weeks, and that's basically it. And so you still have 1 more mini proposal due in a couple of days, and then sort of the big one, and I guess the big is a wrong word. The final one is due. I think it's May 5th, if I remember correctly, or May 1st. And so it doesn't have to be bigger than these individual assignments. It perhaps may need to be a little bit bigger than the individual, but it doesn't have to incorporate everything, but only the specific type of question, hypothesis, and methods that you decide to pursue as your dissertation or a study, or just simply for this course. So it doesn't have to contain more than 1 hypothesis and more than 1 methodology, unless you want to include more. But otherwise, it doesn't have to include the whole range of methods that we covered in the course. So yeah, May 2 is the paper. Yeah, May 2. Thank you so much, Karen. All right, today we have a very interesting and a little unusual lecture, and I think I like this one most. All the previous ones, you probably had some of that stuff covered in other courses, and this is the stuff that, or everything that we've talked about in the previous lectures, this is what you can read in textbooks. Today, we will talk about some things that they may be discussed in textbooks, although not so much in textbooks, more in papers. But many of these things are sort of experience-based, I guess, and maybe even to some extent taboo, or something that we normally don't talk about. We only joke about those kinds of things. So there will be, for example, quite a few references today to Reviewer 2. You know who Reviewer 2 is, right? So, and so it's kind of a joke, but at the same time, not so much a joke because, you know, having been on both sides of the fence, both as an author and as a reviewer, I often find myself, you know, in the role of Reviewer 2. And in fact, I'll share with you some of the real reviews that I wrote that, you know, I was not happy with the paper. So I'll discuss, you know, we'll discuss what people sometimes do to deceive Reviewer 2 or make Reviewer 2 happy, why sometimes Reviewer 2 is not happy with your work, and what you can do to sort of minimize those kinds of problems. So, but anyway, we'll talk today about some of the things that sort of are related to fine-tuning your work, and I guess it's easier if I just start talking about this rather than doing the big introduction. So let me share my screen, and so I named today's lecture, I did everything right, but the reviewer is still unhappy. Reviewers are still unhappy. Why? And so some of those problems could be quite legitimate. And so we love to complain about Reviewer 2, but sometimes our studies are indeed imperfect. And so on the one hand, you want to know what makes them imperfect. On the other hand, you want to know how to fix the problem. And so I will start with the good old story that you probably have heard related to the problems with the p-values, right? So you all know what p-values are, and you probably know that there is a debate going on now for at least 20 years about the problems with p-values. And in fact, there are quite a few studies, and I've included some in your readings there, that literally call for banning p-values. And a bunch of journals, especially in psychology now, essentially forbid reporting p-values. I think they say that you can still report them if you want, but we no longer require them, and we demand something else instead. So you can include p-values, but they are not essential anymore. But the truth is, or why the debate, if you missed sort of this whole discussion, so you know that we all live in a publish or perish world. So we have to publish to, you know, to be promoted. And the problem is that journals want to publish sort of interesting studies. Plus journals are biased towards studies that find an effect and against studies that find no effect. So nobody wants to find or publish a study that says, I looked if A affects B and found that no, A does not affect B. So it doesn't sound interesting, it doesn't sound compelling, and so publishing that study is much more difficult. Now, what does A affect B mean? there are many things that it can mean, but for practical purposes, over the last 50 years, maybe even 70 years, it all boiled down to whether or not you get the p-values of 0.05 or lower. So we've been obsessed with this significance testing. And so basically we had that cutoff of 0.05 p-value. And if you're lucky to have p-values of 0.05, you proved something, you confirmed something, you found the effect. And if not, you didn't. And so if you did find p-values of 0.05 or lower, the study is significant or found significant results. And so they are easier to publish, and the other way around, the study is not interesting, it didn't find an effect. So we kind of dichotomize those, longitudinal, possible outcomes into yes or no. And so what happens is that authors, in an attempt to get published, often sort of chase that p-value of 0.05 or lower. As one classic said, we torture our data until they confess. And we'll talk today, I'm not even sure how to label this lecture, because in a sense, I will tell you some of the data torture techniques that lead to the best confessions. So I'll basically tell you what researchers do to get the values they want to get. And I will obviously present it in the light or in the way that you shouldn't be doing that. This is bad. But the truth is that most people engage in those activities. It doesn't mean that, well, as you'll see, it doesn't mean that there is something honest or dishonest going on there, but there are some techniques that are borderline sort of, not good research. And so in any case, as we are trying to chase those p-values of 0.05 or less, we sometimes engage in some of those activities that we will review. And experienced reviewers too, they have a good sense of smell. They smell when you're trying to sort of BS them. And so I'll tell you or show you today what your colleagues often engage in and what you will be tempted to engage in, and why reviewers too may detect that and be not happy about it. And we'll even look at some examples when it cost people their careers. So yes, publishing is tough, and you probably have seen this meme many times. But yes, at the time when you think that you're done with your paper, it's only the beginning. So it's not the end. And often the revisions and reviews are, take many years. And sometimes you go through 4 or 5 rounds of review, and even then you can be rejected. I'll be referring to a paper in my very last slide that I reviewed yesterday. And so that paper was based on data from 2018. From which I assume it's been rejected several times before it made to this journal at this time. So, listen, but yeah, yes, go ahead.
Hey, Vas, if you're going to use that meme right in the middle of those two, you have to put a picture of Leonardo being maimed by the bear, being mauled by the bear. And that's the review process.
What's that? So, yeah, what was that movie Invictus or whatever it was?
So he's all happy in Titanic, and then he's mauled by the bear by the peer review process, and then ultimately.
Yeah, that's a good one. I should have. Yeah, good point. Yeah, and so studies, journals like interest in studies. But the problem is that as we chase interest, and we often publish bad research. I wanted to say some impolitically correct term here, but yes, bad research. You probably still remember the big stories when, studies show that chocolate makes you skinny, or red wine is good for your health, or coffee reduces chances of Alzheimer. This one is driving me crazy. Not only there had been many studies, but tens of millions had been spent on these programs based on research that presumably showed that if you take teenagers to prison and leave them there for a few hours and let the inmates yell at them and basically abuse them, then teens will be scared of prisons, and so that will reduce the teen, chances of teen delinquency. And more recent studies show that there is no effect, and perhaps even a negative effect here, not a positive effect as expected. And then also you probably have heard about the study about power posing. You know that study? So that one that said, and we'll talk more about the study in a minute. I'll talk about it as an example, but the study says that if you spend a few minutes taking a power pose, like striking a pose, like, like Wonder, Superman or something, taking space, that increases your testosterone level, reduces your cortisol level, you're more effective as a negotiator, or makes you more effective as a negotiator, and increases your chances of success in your career. And so these are interesting studies, and they all resulted in, many of them resulted in, TED Talks with millions of views, lots of publicity, but in many cases they turned out to be completely incorrect, or even not only not true, but sometimes completely opposite to the truth. And so again, there is a good reason to believe that that what the researchers told us was not because they really found it, but because they got too creative with their data, so to speak. So let's talk a little. Yeah.
Can I just ask, it's so interesting because I mean, Amy Cuddy, somebody mentioned that. I'm familiar with that too, or familiar. So these things get a life of their own, and they go off and the world believes them. Is it ever, I mean, I had heard that one, they could not be replicated. The results couldn't be replicated, but is it actually, garbage, like the opposite or something?
I actually have the whole story, so I'll cover that. I did additional research today. I knew about the story, but I did a lot of research today specifically on that one, just to see where we stand. And so I'll share with you what we know about that study as of today. But yes, it looks like it's basically garbage. Like it's
so the only people who ever find out about that though are the few researchers that
yeah. And again, I'll present a lot of interesting statistics related to, how do we know if it's garbage, or how do we know that there is a lot of garbage out there? The surgeon's law, right? 80% of everything is crap. So does it apply to research? Well, it does. How do we know? Well, it turns out there are ways to know. And so I'll talk about some of those techniques that, for example, reviewers to apply to test whether or not it's sort of garbage or not. But going back to the p-values, and it's sort of sometimes referred to also as the problem with the null hypothesis testing. The problem is that, yes, as I said, it dichotomizes the conclusion. So technically your confidence level in whether or not the results are true can be anywhere between 0% and 100%. And it can be anything in between. But with this sort of 0.05, we dichotomize that in sort of good and bad, so to speak. And so not only does that overly simplify the story and kind of sorts the studies in good and bad, but in many cases it makes really good studies indistinguishable from sort of marginally good studies, so to speak. So if you say that p-value is significant, it sounds, you say the same thing about p-value, for example, 0.05 versus p-value of 0.0001. And so those are very different types of results, but when we just put that asterisk for significance, it sort of, makes them equal, or at least make them look equal. And that's a very, very different thing. So the problem also with the p-values is that they have a very little practical meaning. So for example, we tested the differences between the two experimental conditions using ANOVA, whatever the conditions were. And let's say our model was significant, and here is the F score, and there is a p-value, so we conclude that A is different from B. Condition A is different from condition B. So while it does tell us that it's statistically significant, practically it doesn't really tell us anything. Like all we can say that, there is less than a 5% chance that when we say there is a difference, there is really a difference. But how big is that difference? We have no idea, especially when you see like F statistics or chi-squared or maybe R. I mean, these numbers, they're not easily translatable. And so when you see even like correlation 0.02 or 0.2, for example, we kind of can guess that it's, somewhat modest or, moderate. But again, it's hard to translate it into the real values because all of these are standardized abstract values. It's not like, for 1 unit change here, you get 2 unit change there. So you have very, very abstract numbers. And so that makes it very difficult to interpret the results. And perhaps that's one of the reasons the practitioners don't like reading scientific journals, because they see all those F values and chi-squared, and they don't really know what it means for their business, right? And the problem is that the p-value has essentially become this sort of, the decider or deciding factor that decides whether or not the research has merit. And the problem here is that not only it causes the researchers to chase this, p less than 0.05, but in many cases, it doesn't really tell us much about the study itself. So just because it kind of sorts it into good and bad, it doesn't really tell us much more. And so as I said, not only there is evidence that 80% of everything that we eventually publish is garbage, the problem is that it's not easy to determine which of the studies that you have in your hands are garbage and which ones are not. Because again, it's impossible to determine at the individual level you can determine that at the cohort level. So you can, calculate what percentage of studies likely are not true. But when you take individual papers, it's hard to say, well, this particular one is true and this one is not. And so, but the chances are that more studies published that have been published are not really true or cannot be replicated or are not, valid. And as a result, that creates a lot of skepticism in our work, for example, from practitioners. And I don't blame them. Again, if there is really evidence that more than half of the studies cannot be replicated, why should they believe us, especially if they don't know which half can be replicated and which one cannot? And so some people seriously argue that p-values have done more damage to science than any other factor. So that was perhaps a mistake to even begin using it, because that kind of put us on their own path and so on. So let's talk about the story of power opposing. It's a good study. It's kind of a famous one because people from Harvard and Stanford were involved, and so Harvard and Columbia were involved. And the TED Talk is still the most viewed TED Talk to time. So it has over 60 million views as of today. And so it's a famous story, has been not only all over the news, but even some of the movies used this story. Like there was this movie about some sort of a consultant who was teaching the politicians to use power poses. There have been also an interesting study about this study that showed that ever since the TED Talk, they noticed that people in the British Parliament, especially from one party, tend to strike power poses when they take part in negotiations. And they believe it's not accidental. They probably have been coached to do it based on the results of this study. And so evidently, as we'll discuss in a minute, the study probably was not really true, but people, it's a compelling idea and people follow it. But anyway, as I said, the idea of the study was that when people take a power pose, sort of, like spread out their, arms and take more space, they not only feel more powerful, but, they get a shot of hormones that sort of increases confidence, and fewer hormones that signal stress to the body are released. And so that leads to all kinds of good things. And so the paper was published in 2010 by 3 researchers. At that time, one of them was, I think, in Columbia. One was, Cuddy was at that time in Northeastern in Boston, and I'm not sure about the third one. Then shortly after, Amy Cuddy did the TED Talk, which became the most popular TED Talk of all time. And then shortly after TED Talk, she got a job at Harvard, tenure track assistant professor in psychology. But then replication started coming in and started showing that, no, it seems like the results could not be replicated. So it seems like power poses don't work.
He's not really around you guys.
So, but then some of these studies started, so the authors started first responding to those studies, trying to defend their results. And I have here links to their publications. But then eventually the lead author of the study, Dana Carney, so she basically said, released a statement, you can read it here, I have the link here, where she said that she no longer believes in power poses. So she no longer believes that it works. And in that statement, she actually discussed why they probably got their own results. Like, for example, there were 42 people in the study overall, but when it came to specific effects, like, for example, the effects on cortisol or the effects on testosterone, so they were trying to save money and time. And so for some of those tests, they had only like 5 people. But then they started also, in a questionable way, treating the outliers. So there were some people who apparently they decided didn't read the instructions correctly because they were striking the poses incorrectly. So they were excluded from the study. So not only making the sample smaller, but kind of suspiciously people whose data did not support the hypothesis were excluded. Then they were also involved in so-called cherry picking. Like, for example, for one of the tests, they used OLS regression first, and the p-value was 0.052, if I remember correctly. But then somebody said instead of using OLS regression, you should use logistic regression, basically calculate the probability. So in the same specification. And in that one, the p-value was 0.048. And so slightly below 0.05. So they reported the one that gave them the good results, didn't report the one that didn't give them the good results. And basically, disguised in that way, the true, more complicated picture. So as the scandal sort of grew and it became a big issue, and the lead author sort of, renounced the results, the one who got the job, Kari, at Harvard, as New York Times put it, quietly left her tenure track position at Harvard. So she's not affiliated with any university at this time. On her personal website, it says that she's still teaching as an adjunct at Harvard Executive Education, but that post is also from years ago. So at this time, it doesn't look like she's even associated with Harvard anymore. And then there is a whole Wikipedia article about the scandal. And then when you go to, for example, TED Talk, there is a note like this below the, they still have the video, but now they have all the links and all the warnings that probably it's not even true, and you have to take it, cautiously. So basically a very big messy situation because of some of these activities that Dana Carney described in her statement. So especially given that she's the first lead author, so I guess it's interesting that she didn't take any blame. She basically says something like, she doesn't say that, but almost like, somebody else did the analysis and my mistake was that I didn't check it carefully enough or something like that. And so, so sometimes it, results in these very unpleasant situations for the authors.
Hey, boss, I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
Now, let's say like she had published this, but didn't cherry pick her stuff, and then just like later, proves that it's just, you can't replicate it or something. How, does that affect you? Because there's going to be studies that you make that aren't going to be, proven later that aren't going to be perfect. But like if she hadn't like engaged in some of the deceptive stuff in here, would the repercussions still have been as strong for her?
Well,
later?
Very importantly, and the reason I chose this study, there was really nothing sort of deceptive, so to speak, per se. And so all of the techniques, I mean, yeah, sometimes I assume people just, fake data. And so that's obviously problematic. And if discovered, obviously it will be a big problem. But most of these techniques and the ones that I already mentioned, and we'll start in the next slide, we'll go more through them one by one. All of them are defensible, meaning that none of them constitutes a definitive, fraud. So you just sort of have to make a lot of decisions. And, given that our career depends on us publishing the study or not, and the publication depends on the P value of 0.05, as they say, it's, where you stand depends on where you sit. So it becomes very difficult to make decisions, against yourself. And so there are many of them, and each of those decisions could be legitimately defended. Like in this particular study, so they had a small sample. Well, it's not a crime. I mean, yes, it was a small sample, but, or for example, they discarded a couple of outliers. Again, they honestly believed that there was something wrong with those people, and they happened to be the ones that sort of, made their results weaker. But they also thought maybe those people didn't strike the poses, right enough. So again, there is no way to prove anything, and that's why they all still have jobs, or at least 2 out of 3. And then obviously sometimes maybe you just got lucky and you got good results, but then when somebody else tries to do a replication, it doesn't work. Does it mean that you faked your data? No, maybe your sample was different, maybe the study context was different, maybe you just got lucky, maybe you made an honest mistake. So that's what makes it very difficult. I think the reason Kari got into much trouble because she got the most attention after the TED Talk, and she's been doing a lot of speaking engagements. And when you watch the TED Talk, I mean, she clearly overstates the results. I mean, she talks about it not as like in the real study, the effect size was 0.048 or even more than 0.05 if you use a different method. But in the TED Talk, she says, yes, we found that this works and this doesn't. Do this and don't do that. And so obviously, in reality, it was borderline difference even if we use the p-value. In the discussions, it all of a sudden becomes this works. And that's a big difference from, yeah, it kind of works, but we're not sure. And so that's where it becomes a little tricky.
Okay, thank you, I appreciate that.
So yeah, so let's talk about some of those questionable techniques. This one, I'll be honest with you, we all have engaged in it, and I do not recall a single study where we didn't do it. And so I'm not even ashamed, not ashamed, I mean, I think it's a very, very legitimate and defensible strategy. The problem is that, again, the incentive is sort of such that it almost creates some sort of a conflict of interest. And here we're talking about adding and dropping variables until you get the right combination. I don't know if you've done your studies, but you always have some variables in the model first. And then you say, well, let's try to add age to it. Let's try to add gender, see how it changes. And, you know, luckily for you, usually whatever you are trying to answer, it's either always significant or never significant. And so it's not even a problem that much in the end, because, you know, if it does predict something, usually it predicts no matter what you add to that model and vice versa. But sometimes it may not. And sometimes you may, you know, drop one variable, add another one, and all of a sudden you have the p-value for your key variable below 0.05. And so obviously people sometimes play with this add and drop variables, and you know, that creates all kinds of distorted results. Sometimes also it's not even about the variables, like let's add age or gender or, you know, company size or whatever else, perhaps as a control. Sometimes for the same outcome, you can have different measures. Like for example, in business, obviously we would often look at company performance. And there are so many different ways to express or operationalize company performance. You can look at Tobin's Q, you can look at sales, market share, reputation, increased number of new products last year, return on assets, return on equity, and so on and so on. And so what often happens, and again, in your optional readings, you have some studies that discuss that it's, you know, there is enough evidence to believe that that's the case. People start with, for example, Tobin's Q. And if it's not significant, they say, well, maybe let's see if it predicts sales. Well, it's still not significant. Well, let's see if it predicts market share. Still not significant. Let's see if it predicts, I don't know, market to book ratio of assets, not market. Oh yeah, this one works. And so people then just choose the measure of the variable, focal variable that works best, and sort of not mention the rest. And so in one of the papers, you see there a discussion from in an editorial letter where they say that, you know, studies almost randomly seem to choose the performance variable, and almost never they explain why they chose this one and not another one. And so there is a reason to believe that maybe, you know, they chose this one and not another one, or not all of them, because, you know, one of them gave a better result than the other ones. And so that's, you know, that's a challenge.
If that happened, in that case, would it be a better idea to have multiple hypotheses with those different measures, and then, you know, say, you know, these hypotheses were not supported, but this one was? Or will you just drop those
practice,
hypotheses?
yeah, I'll have a slide, you know, what the good practice, you know, the right way to do it. But let's say you're, for example, trying to predict company performance. The honest way to do it would be to try all of them and then report results for all of them. Especially when you're talking about company performance. In most cases, you're using, let's say, a database with all of those indicators in it, and you have more than one. And you say, okay, well, the result for Tobin's Q was this, for sales it was this. And again, if you're lucky, maybe all of them will be significant. Then you can proudly say that no matter how I tested, the results were robust. So I always saw the same effect. On the other hand, if you find that it does predict one of them, but doesn't predict the other five, again, it would be honest, you know, to say that, yeah, I looked at it and it predicts, you know, subjective reputation of the company, but doesn't necessarily predict sales, for example. In that case, obviously, you will have a much harder time, you know, publishing the study, and that's what the problem, you know, is. But yeah, you want to be as transparent, both with the reviewers, but also for yourself. You probably want to test all of those possible different combinations to make sure that it's always what you expected to see. And then, you know, obviously, if it's not the same outcome each time, you know, you should ask yourself, so are the results robust enough for me that I want to pursue this study, or maybe I should drop it because it doesn't look to be stable or robust? So, so here I wanted to put that in a separate topic, but I thought I would include here, include it as a problem. So this is a very legitimate technique, and sometimes it's actually very necessary to transform your variables. But what some researchers do is, if they don't find the linear effect, they start playing with these different transformations. So you know what data transformations are, right? So sometimes, so you know that the assumption of most of the data analysis techniques, like for example, regression analysis, is that you have a linear effect. So the way it does, it fits the line into the dots and it's a straight line. But the real effect could be curvilinear. So maybe it's something like here on the, you know, here. So the further you get on X, the faster the rate of growth. And so because OLS cannot work with curvilinear lines, what you do is you convert this curvilinear relationship into a linear one. And so, for example, if you square your X, it will make this kind of relationship straight line. If you take a log, it would be this kind of, you know, diminishing rate of growth. And then obviously, you know, for the squared, technically it's a U shape and inverse U. So, and these are very legitimate techniques. Like, for example, if you wanted to predict the effects of, let's say, income, obviously the difference or the effect of a $1,000 change for someone who makes $10,000 will be much stronger than for someone who makes $200,000. So an extra $1,000 for a family that makes only $1,000, that's a big difference. So for them, maybe that extra $1,000 will make a huge difference in, for example, motivation to perform. But if somebody's salary is $200,000, that extra $10,000 probably will not be even noticeable. And the person probably will have a much, the effect will be much weaker for that reason, And there are other transformations that we see less, but, still sometimes visible, present in studies. And so what happens, sometimes people look at the direct line and the effect is not there. So they say, well, let's try to square that variable and see maybe it's a quadratic term, or maybe let's take a log of it, or maybe let's take some other transformation. And so by engaging in those transformations, they sort of see which one gives the best data, and then they say, okay, we found that A affects B, but it appears to be a nonlinear effect, and so we found that effect only after taking the log, for example, or vice versa, if it's like age, or maybe if it's income, or maybe GDP per capita. It's customary to take the log of that variable because usually at the higher end, the effect is weaker. But people, may not find that effect, so they think, well, maybe I'll just keep the regular, not log, just straight line. And so as long as it gives me the better results, hopefully a reviewer too will not pay attention to these kinds of things. So control variables is kind of related to finding the right combination, but it's a very distinct way of playing with variables in your data set. I cannot tell you how many studies I rejected, and sorry for being a reviewer too here. But so I'm in cross-cultural management, as you know, and very, very often, in fact, I would say probably like half of all the studies that I review deal with effects of culture on whatever that is. And usually when we say culture, we mean individualism, collectivism. So probably about 80% of the studies on culture deal with individualism, collectivism. And so the researcher would find that individualism affects something and collectivism has the opposite effect, whatever that may be. And so what I know from my own experience, and after reading hundreds of studies, we know that individualism, collectivism very strongly correlates with wealth. So either personal income or GDP per capita or HDI of the country. So at both levels, individual and country level. And so what I know that once you control for wealth, either for individual income or for the country development, the effect of individualism, collectivism disappears. And so I've seen so many studies where there are no controls. They just correlate individualism, collectivism with whatever that is. For example, living with parents, right? So like a recent study that I saw, the effects of culture on basically household arrangements. And so the argument was that people in individualist cultures prefer to live alone, and people in collectivist cultures prefer to live with their parents. Seems very compelling. So they had all kinds of countries. They looked at the individualism, collectivism level in those countries. They looked at the percentage of families that live basically multi-generational households, and voila, they found a correlation. And my argument was, no, it has nothing to do with culture. It has everything to do with money. If I have money, I will live separately. If I don't have money, I'll have to live with my parents. And so once you control for income, or once you control for the GDP per capita measure, obviously the effect of culture disappears. And so when people don't include that, reviewer too may not be happy. And then in many cases, you kind of suspect that they probably tested it. It didn't work out the way it was supposed to work. So they didn't dropped it and never mentioned it, hoping that I will not notice. And by the way, if it were still significant, they would then revise, resubmit the paper, and they will say, oh, see, once we add HDI or GDP per capita, the effect still stands. But most of them never do that, from which I make the assumption that, yes, probably it was not about culture, it was about something else. Outliers, this is another one. So this is a tricky one. We have to do something about outliers, and there are multiple options, multiple ways to handle it. We can just delete the case, we can replace the missing values or the outlier values maybe with averages or something else, assuming that maybe it's some sort of an error. So there are all kinds of things. And so what researchers do, unfortunately, they run the results first with all of the data. And if they're happy to get their p-values of 0.05 or less, They just happily proceed with writing the paper. Everything's fine. But then if it's not significant, then they start looking, well, maybe there are some outliers that mess up my results. And so maybe we should drop them, or maybe replace them with some predicted values or something else. And so, you know, what is an outlier? And so there is really no fixed rule about that. And sometimes people say if the standard deviation of the score is, if the score is more than 3 standard deviations away from the mean, then it's an outlier. Others say that maybe it should be 5 standard deviations. But then some people say, well, I don't know, maybe 2.5 is enough. So let's exclude everyone who's there. Or maybe let's see, you know, like, yeah, I don't like that data point. It must be an error. It cannot be like that. So, and once I exclude that number, my results become significant. So maybe I should do it. And then people sometimes honestly come up sort of self-deception, come up with good reasons. So they say, well, maybe this person didn't follow the instructions, like what those power poses people did. Or maybe they just didn't read the questions, the survey questions carefully, and they were just randomly answering the answers, because I can tell there are too many 5s on this scale. He probably was just going all 5, so it's definitely, you know, didn't read the question, so I should delete this case. Or maybe the survey is incomplete, so maybe there is one question missing, so maybe he was not very diligent, or she was not very diligent. And even though there is data for my question, but I can tell that the reviewer didn't you know, follow through with the whole survey, and maybe I should delete him or her altogether. And then sometimes people just engage in, you know, other sort of fantasizing. The person was too old or too young, or maybe too senior on the organizational hierarchy, or maybe the person was late for the test, or maybe he was drunk, or, you know, whatever the reasons. And so it cannot be, because, you know, otherwise my results are, you know, like, my theory is solid, and if I only delete this person, the results will be better. So it must be something with that respondent. And so obviously, again, sort of none of these techniques is illegitimate. Often it is the case that maybe somebody was not following the instructions, or maybe is too old or too young, or, you know, or maybe even showed up drunk for the study, for the experiment. But, you know, often we make those decisions in favor of the p-value as opposed to truth. Cherry picking the sample. So what happens often is, you have a large sample, or let's say you have a sample to begin with, and everything's fine, so you proceed with writing the results. But if it's not right, or maybe everything looks so good that you feel adventurous, and you go ahead and even do proper tests for robustness. So like, for example, you split your sample into 2 random halves and see if you can still get the same results with the random subsample from your sample. Or maybe you had a few years of your data, and so you checked with the whole sample, and then everything was fine. And then you think, okay, well, let's check the data year by year just to make sure that it works. This one, by the way, is a real problem, not problem, but a real sort of issue for me. So for Xculture, we collect data every semester. And there are slight differences from semester to semester. And so sometimes we start with the whole data set with tens of thousands of cases, and we find what we expect to see. But the good science would say, well, now check it semester by semester, because there may be some differences in different semesters. Maybe the economy was growing in one semester, but then, you know, falling down in the next one. Maybe you added coaches in one of the semesters, and that made all the difference. Maybe there was a monetary compensation, as there was a reward for the winning team. And so good science would, you know, request or require that I check the robustness, the results for each separate semester, and hope that I get the same results each time. But if I don't find that, or people who don't find that, often then they get into these kind of creative cherry picking of the sample. They would say, well, maybe I should only use the year 2019, because in the year 2020, there was the pandemic, and maybe that didn't, you know, had some effect. I cannot explain why it would have an effect, but I have better results in 2019, so I should use 2019. There must have been something wrong with 2020. Or if everything is good in 2020, then you say, well, I'm going to drop 2019 because this is outdated data. That's too old. I have a newer year. And so you kind of start selecting subsamples that give you the right results. Or in my case, I guess I could engage into saying, you know, like, okay, I use the data from 2017 for whatever reason, because after that we had the coaching program, and I could not replicate the results using the more recent samples. But it's not because the results are not robust. There must have been something different in my sample. So therefore I'll use that one, which was the right sample. And if you still have no luck, so some people engage, I've seen people engage in things like, for example, they would exclude all respondents younger or older than term age. or maybe, you know, include only managers, only women, or only Americans, or only native English speakers, all the way to, and here I'm trying to be funny, but, you know, everybody whose name contains letter A. And so obviously, again, in this case, if you cherry pick your sample enough, you'll eventually come up with a subsample that will give you the right results. And again, in many cases, people honestly believe that that's, you know, they can explain why they did it. Because yes, you know, we excluded everybody who was not manager, or we excluded everybody who was not an English native speaker. And so that creates obviously some problems with the results. Crippled p-values, kind of talked about that a little bit. So what sometimes people do is they report values that are less than 0.05, or, you know, put the asterisk there. And so there is a big difference between 0.0499 and 0.0001. But when you report only the asterisks, you know, all of those seem equal, and it sort of obscures the interpretation of the results and makes it a little bit, you know, less informative. What many people still do is sometimes you would see sort of like a little cross edit, you know, you have like 2 asterisks, 1 asterisk, and then you have like a little cross. And so they would say that it's marginally significant. So you would report your p-value 0.01, p-value 0.05, and then p-value 0.1. And you say, you know, let's say, for example, you wanted to see that A affects B, and you say in the text, the effect of A was as expected positive, albeit only marginally significant. And so it kind of sounds like you found support for your study, you acknowledge that it was not strong, but you sort of, it fits your narrative, and you know, kind of put it that way and hope that the reviewers will be okay with this approach. I don't see that much of these, you know, marginally significant wording lately, but it used to be quite popular in the 80s and 90s. I remember seeing quite a few studies that reported all these 3 different levels of significance.
Do they do trend in the management literature? Did I miss that part? Sorry, my daughter was on my lap, but they used to do that in medicine when we didn't get anything that was significant, and we would say, oh, there's a trend that this is happening.
Yeah.
Trend became this dirty
exactly,
word.
Yeah. So it seems to lean in that direction, but more research is needed, right? Yeah, so you kind of, you know, it's exactly like I expected, quite not as significant, but more studies are needed, but we definitely have an indication that what I expected would be there, so yeah. A related issue is so-called HARKing, so hypothesizing after results unknown. And it's kind of related to hacking p-values, but it's a very distinct type of a problem. And again, I'll be honest with you, from my experience, HARKing happens, it's hard to define, I mean, like what percentage, but let me put it this way, it's an extremely common practice that you have a story, and then you come up with the hypothesis, and then you go and look for the literature, you know, to support your theory, so to speak. And this is the one that drives me crazy. Like, that's the one that I hate most. I've seen it so many times, and I sort of hate that reviewers force me to do HARKing. Like, you know, like often I would have a very good study with a very good question. I find the answer. So like, for example, one study that I'm particularly proud of and had a very difficult time publishing, we went through 7 rejections, I believe, until it was published, and then eventually it was published. But so the study, and I did mention it before, the study looked at whether or not students from better schools perform better. So is the rank of the university correlate with, does the rank of the university correlate with performance? And I thought it was a very good, compelling question. As an employer, I want to know, do students from better schools perform better? Should I hire students from top schools, or it doesn't matter? As a student, I want to know, should I apply to the best colleges, or it doesn't really matter? So it seems like a very important question. We found the results, we found the effect, so that it does matter, but very, you know, the effect is very weak. And the reviewers keep torturing me about the theory. So they said, you know, what's your theory? Who cares about the theory? But in the end, to publish it, we had to do HARKing. So we looked at what we found. We, you know, modeled through the literature, found a lot of things that said, yeah, you know, there is like some Mendenhall-Manton 64th theory that says that there should be. And so kind of post hoc, we wrapped this set of results in a theory, sort of stated the hypothesis in accordance with that theory, and basically sold the study that way. And so in my opinion, that's a very counterproductive technique, but, you know, it seems like it works most of the time, or, you know, researchers engage in that often. They may have one hypothesis or one specific, you know, relationship in mind when they start, but then often they sort of, you know, once they have the data, they engage in this data mining. So they look at what correlates with what. And in many cases, what happens, they sometimes drop some of those a priori hypotheses that were not supported. They found some relationships that were significant, and so they come up with hypotheses for those relationships, and basically they hypothesize after the results are known, and then produce a neat story that fits the data. And as I said, it seems to be quite harmful because in many cases, sort of a lot of junk makes into the studies. There have been attempts at multiple journals to sort of have a flow where they would accept first the study proposals, like a study proposal with a very detailed description of what hypotheses will be tested, how the data will be collected, how the data will be analyzed. And the idea was that once your proposal is accepted, you will be guaranteed publication no matter what your results are. So if you hypothesize that A will affect B, and you say, this is how I will collect the data, and this is the test I will do. So even if your results are completely zero, non-significant, they will still publish it as promised, because as long as you follow the procedure, as long as you do it exactly the way you described. But somehow, even though it's been popular for like about 10, 15 years, like almost every journal said that we will either have a section. Academy of Management at some time was saying that they will have a whole separate journal dedicated to this kind of research or this kind of approach. Somehow it kind of quietly went away. And it seems to me that it's going back to that issue, interest in research, whatever that means, because probably too much stuff there was not interesting and nobody wanted to publish papers in top journals that are not interesting, that didn't find the results. So, but yeah, that would be productive. Yes.
Sorry, going back to your study, Christy asked the question, which about the paper. Is it the one that was predictive power of university pedigree?
Yes, predictive power of the university degree, yeah. Yeah.
Okay, and then also that was adapted in also an HBR article?
Yeah,
okay.
And luckily for us, again, I kind of overstated a little bit the situation here. So luckily eGym, when they published it, they didn't demand too much theory. So we sort of have a theory there, but it's more, we try to explain why university rank should be associated with performance. Like, for example, why should it have a positive effect? We had this model that we called SET. So maybe it's the selection, so they select better students, and as a result, they show better performance. Environment, being among smart professors, smart peers, you get sort of, inspired and you perform better. And then T training, so maybe universities train more. But then we also look at negative effects, which we labeled ear. So it was, envy. So sometimes people may envy you and they will sabotage your work, and so your performance suffers. Arrogance, maybe you're, being from a top school, you're arrogant, so that sort of damages performance, and too much focus on the task at the expense of the focus on the relationships. And so it was sort of a theory in a sense that it was a classification of the effects, but not a traditional theory like a set of hypotheses. So the hypothesis still stayed the same, that universal rank should have a positive effect. But in any case, we did spend much more time trying to theorize after we knew the results. And in my opinion, that was very counterproductive. It didn't really add anything to the study. And we just lost many years before we published a good research paper. So, I believe in one of the papers, when we took the theory class, there was this story again about a guy from a top school, apparently someone with the Nobel Prize, or at least there were people in the audience with the Nobel Prizes. And he said, we looked at the presentation. It was an interesting study, but then the presenters admitted that they have a difficult time coming up with the theory. And then the whole room was trying to engage, like review the literature archives in their heads, trying to think about some, theory that would be appropriate to explain what they found. And so again, in many cases, people come up with those, hypotheses after the fact. So here are some of the types of HARKing. So this one from a paper in your optional readings. And so it talks about the 4 different types. And so the less problematic, as he calls it, so hypothesis proliferation. So that's where they find something that was perhaps not necessarily part of the original design, but they thought it was interesting, so they added into this. Then HARKing, so in this case, you obtain the results and then fit the hypothesis to the results. But more problematic, obviously, are cherry picking. So where you have you test 20 different relationships, 3 of them turn out to be significant, and you write a paper around those 3 and you forget about the other 17. So in this case, obviously, by chance, some of them will be significant. In fact, if you do 20, let's say we have the 95%, significance. So, well, 1 out of 20 will be by chance significant. And so you look at that one and you report that one and nothing else, and it creates a very distorted picture of the reality. And then also what they call question trolling, but in this case, it's literally data mining. So you mine and mine, you don't know what you're looking for, but once you find something significant, that's when that's something interesting. You need to write a paper about it. The term I use sometimes when I engage in this practice, and again, this one is very hard to avoid because there may be something legitimate to data mining, like I call it, let the data tell the story. And so sometimes I say, well, let's just look at the data and see what the data are telling us. Is there anything there or not? And so it sounds okay when you say it that way. Yes, you have the data, you want to see what predicts performance. And I don't necessarily have any, predictors. So I want to see what predicts performance in global virtual teams. And let's say I found that cultural intelligence predicts global virtual team performance. So I'll write a paper about that. The problem is that I have 2,000 variables in the X-culture data set. And so by chance, like even if it was completely random, by chance, some of them would be significant. And so sometimes it becomes, is it really a sin? I don't know. Maybe, your data told you something and you just describe it. But if you engage it in this activity that way, it often leads to errors. Let's put it this way. Why is it a problem? As we said, people, the expectation is that, yes, if we use the 0.05 as a cutoff, there is always a 5% chance that there will be some error. And we would say, okay, well, if everything was perfectly honest and perfectly fine, in all of the published studies, about 5% of them perhaps would be, let's say, not true. So 95% are true, and 5% found what they found only because of the chance. So it was only, just accidentally happened to be significant. But in reality, what happens is that, as I said, researchers engage into, trying dozens of different model specifications, adding dropping variables. They try to work with outliers in different ways or handle them in different ways. Sometimes they collect additional data. Let's say, you believe that A affects B. You collected, N of 50, but nothing significant. And you think, well, maybe I should collect a few more cases. Maybe it's too small a sample. So you collect another 10 and maybe then another 10. And so you keep collecting cases until you find your results. Or maybe you use OLS regression, but it doesn't work. And you think, well, maybe OLS regression is not the best method. Let's try HLM, SEM, PLS, and whatever else. And then voila, HLM gives you the results that are significant. Well, that must be because of, it was an inappropriate method. And then again, you try 20 different things, and of those 5 or 3 were significant. So you write paper around those 3 hypotheses and you drop the other ones. And so you rearrange your hypothesis around the picture. And so what happens is that in the end, you have a nice, neat study that you send to a journal. And then even if in the end, you tried all of those techniques and it turned out to be insignificant, in many cases, you just put that study in your file drawer and you never even look at it again. And so it's never published. So only those that are significant are published. Or worse yet, you have the courage to send it to a journal, even if it's insignificant, but the journal doesn't want to publish it. They say, well, what's interesting here? Nothing. And so what happens is that in the end of all the studies that are published, many, many more than just the 5% are sort of true. And again, when they have a number of attempts to replicate a bunch of studies as a replication sort of experiment. And so depending on which one you look at, there was this one sponsored, there was some sort of a foundation, I forgot the name, where they looked at, I believe, like 100 most commonly reported effects. And they hired some researchers and said, we're going to test those relationships using our own data. We'll collect the data, and we want to do everything sort of, according to the, to the textbook. And so they found that, like, the replications was, they were able to replicate the results in only like 38% of the cases. So potentially, problematic. Now, how do we know that it's going on? Well, we tried some replications and it didn't work. But also when you look at, for example, distribution of p-values across different studies, you will notice that there is a spike around 0.05. So you will notice that there is like an unusually large number of studies with right around 0.05. And so it probably tells us that those p-values were closer to some larger values. But again, after some torture and creative techniques, they were sort of, shifted to 0.05, and that's why you have an abnormally large number of publications in that range. Here is a table from another study by a couple of colleagues here. So they looked at the difference in correlations when the relationship was hypothesized versus not hypothesized. So basically, let's say agreeableness, or let's say here autonomy. So does job autonomy predict performance? And so some studies look at prediction, job autonomy and performance as the focal point of the study. That's the hypothesis. Other studies look at something completely different. Maybe they study communication or conflicts, but autonomy is still part of the study, and and performance is still part of the study. And so somewhere in that paper, they have the full correlation table. And so you have the correlations reported when the study, correlations reported for all variables, even if it was not part of the hypothesis. And so as you can see, for many of these outcomes, the difference is significant. Like, for example, when you look at job autonomy, so if it's part of the hypothesized, part of the hypothesis, the average effect size was 0.16. But if it's not, it's only 0.05. Distributive justice predicts performance. Well, if that's what you hypothesize, then the studies will report a correlation of about 0.24. But if it's not hypothesized, the effect will be 3 times weaker, and so on and so on. So here, 4 times difference. So emotional stability apparently predicts performance. Well, quite a few studies looked at it. About 14 studies hypothesized the relationship, another 19 accidentally looked at it. And the difference is 4 to 1. Huge difference, right? Here also procedural justice, 4 to 1. So definitely tells us that something's going on. Does it mean that each of these studies are wrong? No, we don't know. But something was definitely going on there.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but how would they have known which studies hypothesized
That's
the outcome and which didn't?
Yeah, so they would look at, let's say, for example, a study that looks, as I said, job autonomy or extroversion. So for one study, that was the hypothesis, that was the study. They wanted to see if people who are extroverts, if they perform better. And so there was a hypothesis that stated people who score high on extroversion will show higher performance. And then there was a study that looked at something else, communication, conflicts. But they also used, like, for example, they wanted to see if extroversion predicts performance. Not extroversion. Extroversion predicts, communication pattern. But somewhere in that study, there was also performance. Maybe they wanted to see if people who perform better, I don't know. And so in the full correlation table, they report all of the correlations, those that are hypothesized, 2 or 3 of them, but all of the remaining ones. And so they just compared those correlations, the ones that were hypothesized and the ones that were not. Here is another example. Like, for example, actually, yeah, that's a question for you. So how would you test it? It's a hypothetical case, but it's a very real one. I actually have seen several papers on the topic. And in fact, I believe I even wrote a negative review on one of those. So the research question is, are there differences in preferences for the type of compensation in China versus the United States? So the hypothesis is that in China, being a collectivist culture, people prefer to be compensated based on team results. Whereas in the United States, being an individualistic culture, people tend to be prefer to be compensated based on individual performance. How would you test this hypothesis? What would you do?
Survey?
All right, so what would you ask then in the survey? Very good. So we'll take a large sample. So we don't want to, no small samples. We'll go to a large company in China and survey, let's say, 600 employees. What would you ask those employees? Well, let's say 300, 2 companies, one in the United States, one in China, and then 300 people in one, 300 in another. So the sample is large. What will you ask them? You will ask them, so would you like to be compensated based on individual performance or based on your team performance, right?
Well,
And,
could you do that in just one company?
Well, let's say, okay, so that's very good. So very good, Susan. So you think that if it's 2 different companies, maybe there is an organizational culture that affects it, right? So
right,
if you, like, let's say survey employees, like Walmart employees in the United States and Lenovo employees in China. And so obviously very different, right? So you take all of those employees will be employees of, let's say, Alibaba or Amazon and Alibaba, similar companies. And all right, so you kind of standardize the context. What else would you pay attention to?
Type of job, role.
Very good. Yeah, again, maybe people, work in teams or don't work in teams, or they are managers or not, employees.
Right. Yeah.
So, but anyway, what I want to show you here, so I actually created a sample here. And so I pretended to be very, very careful here. And so this is the question: how would you like to be compensated? The answers are: one, based on my individual performance, mostly based on individual, half and half, mostly based on team, and based on team, right? And so here is a set of employees from the United States. I actually went as far as 1,200 people. So I have 600 people from the United States and 600 people from China. How would you test the difference between these two samples? You probably would do the t-test, right? So we have two independent samples. So t-test, you can do it right here. So you have the first array, you have the second array, and I think that's enough, but I think it also asks you for the number of tails. We will do two-tailed, so we don't want to take any chances. And we want to take, what's the third one, type? I think we will do two independent samples, which is 3. And my p-value, a little too low. So my p-value is 0.05. So I can almost say that it's significant. It rounds to 0.05, so I can say that it's significant. So if only I could find a few outliers. So I want China to be, lower. Oh, sorry, higher, right? So I think these two people were drunk, so I'm going to delete them. Oh, significant. Yeah, only 2 people out of 200. I think they didn't read my results. So those 2 out of 600, that's nothing. But now it's significant. So what can I say based on this study? I can say that people in China prefer to be compensated based on teams, and people in the United States prefer to be compensated based on individual performance. Now, as a reviewer too, I will reject this study. Why would I reject it? It seems very accurate. In fact, you know what? I'll delete only 1 outlier. I think that should be enough. Yeah, only 1 outlier was enough. So why do I have a problem with this study? Because from the managerial point of view, this is utter BS. So I see that the average for the United States is 1.96. So it tells me that most Americans prefer to be compensated mostly based on individual performance. I see that it's the same for China. It's basically 2. So there is really indistinguishable difference based on managerial practical implications. And yes, there is a 0.01 difference, right? 0.01 difference on the scale. In fact, we can even, average of this minus average of this. And so there is some difference, and that difference is statistically significant. Yeah, I guess but it's a 0.1 points. I mean, can we really say that, one method works better in one country than in the other? No. I mean, they basically are identical. Just because you have enough people, obviously there is a statistically significant difference. But practically speaking, it just doesn't make any sense. And so therefore, I would reject the study. If they said that we found no difference, even though it was statistically significant, I would find that interesting. I would say, yes, you surveyed so many people and you essentially got the same responses. But if they try to claim that there is a difference, and because of that, you need to use different compensation practices, policies in the 2 countries, it's just misleading. I mean, the difference is really not really that important, right?
But they wouldn't have submitted that to you, right? If they had stated there really wasn't a statistically significant result, right? Like, so is that one of the...
the problem is that because we're dealing here with the Likert type scales, it is statistically significant. You're not dealing with the real units. Like, if it were some sort of dollars and there is like a $1 difference, even though it's statistically significant, we understand it doesn't mean much. Here you have an abstract scale, so it's not really, and yeah, it's statistically significant. The p-value is significant, so you can claim the difference. But as I said, once I look at the mean differences, I would say, yeah, I don't know if it's meaningful. I mean, it seems to me like both of them are virtually at the same point.
Right. What I was trying to say is that if they're, I mean, they probably wouldn't have even submitted it if they, I'm guessing they wouldn't even try to submit it if they didn't see something statistically significant. Is, so is that one of those areas where you're sitting there as a researcher, you're like, well, could they have said to you, like, you know, we really couldn't find a difference? Like, yes, there's a statistically significant difference, but if you really drill down to the number, there's only a 0.1 like average difference between the two. If you had said something like that, would that have hurt the prospects of it getting published, though, based on what you've been saying?
That's a very good point. Yes, it would have hurt the prospects of being published. And so, you know, if you say that, yeah, we compared Americans and Chinese and we found no difference. No, you know, the only reason where it can be a good story or, you know, case where everybody believes that there must be a difference, and you come and you say, no, I tested it, there is really no difference. And so in that case, you know, yes, all of that you've been told in grad school or MBA program, it's not true. I tested and it seems like they have basically indistinguishable preferences. And so if there had been especially a lot of studies that showed that there is a difference and you disprove it, or it's a common belief that, you know, Chinese have to be such and such and Americans have to be such and such, maybe in that case you would publish it. But yeah, if you basically were like this, yeah, so, and yeah, you yeah, I didn't expect that one, changing one outlier, all of a sudden you're significant, even though you have 600 cases. So, yeah. So tricky, yeah.
This is speaking to power, right?
Yeah, and very good. Yeah, so we did talk about, you know, power in your test. So you have only 2 variables, and here I probably overpowered my test. You want to have at least 30 cases per variable, but you probably don't need 600 cases when you only compare it to variables. And so
yeah. So do you recommend doing a like post hoc power analysis or
not only do I recommend, it's usually required. The problem is that almost nobody does it. I mean, in most cases, people are so afraid that the sample is too small, or too often samples are small. So when the sample finally is large, nobody worries that it could be too large. But the truth is that it could be, especially if it's, you know, some sort of archival data where every employee had to respond. It could be that it's overpowered. And so we should be doing the power analysis and, you know, basically see how big your sample should be before the chances of type 2 error are too, type 1 error are too high.
So can I ask, and again, I might be speaking medical-ese here. I don't know if, I suspect there's probably something comparable, but in medical, we have what's called a minimally clinically important difference, right? So everybody's familiar with the 10-point pain scale, right? Zero means no pain. 10 means I'm Leonardo DiCaprio actively being mauled by a bear, right? So in medicine, right, anything less than a 2-point change is considered to be irrelevant. So if you go from a 5 to a 6, who cares? But if you go from a 5 to a 7, okay, well, that's probably significant, right? So so then we can do like an a priori power of 80% that basically says that, you know, I'm trying to find a difference of 2, and then how do I find, you know, what is my sample size have to be to identify if there is truly a difference of 2 between these 2 populations, right?
Yeah.
But I don't know how to do that. I don't know if that's anything we're going to go over at any point.
Yes, power analysis is a relatively simple stuff. It's almost the same thing as, remember when we had those tables for calculating the significance of like correlation, you know, number of cases and correlation. You have similar tables. And in fact, if you type power analysis online, you will find a lot of data sets where you basically say what kind of effect you're trying to determine, what kind of difference you want to see, and it gives you the range of what the sample should be. Because if it's too small, chances are you will make a type 2 error. If it's too large, chances are you'll make a type 1 error. And it's not a, you know, drag science is not like it has to be like 522 people. One too many, one too few, and it's not, you know, correct. But you normally will say, okay, you have to have at least, usually we say like 10 cases per variable. But once you have more than 100 cases per variable, maybe it's already problematic, or at least you will have that curve that shows that, you know, probability of the error increases too much.
Because it seems to me that if you can do an a priori power, you can save so much time in collecting data once you reach whatever that is. So if you need 37 responses, but you take an extra year so you can get to 52 responses or whatever, man, you just wasted a year when you could have stopped at 37, exactly. Right? So then my other question is, so you talked about on that scale, that 5-point Likert scale, the change of 0.05 or whatever that change was is irrelevant. Like I said, in medicine, we have those minimally clinically identified differences. I mean, is there is there anything in business that's similar that basically says that, you know, a 1 on a 5-point scale is significant, or a 0.5 on a 5-point scale is significant, or to essentially whatever, not clinically, or meaningful, you know, maybe not significant as well, but meaningful. Is there anything like that?
Yes and no. You are asking a very right question, and I'll give you the answer. So it's not precisely the way you're describing it, although I'll have a snapshot of a paper from medical research where they have precisely what you say. We kind of have the same thing. So we'll be talking about effect sizes instead of significance testing. And so there is something very similar. Yeah. So a couple more things that I wanted to talk. So overstating the effect. So sometimes people sort of overstate, and we talked about this, you know, how you want to be compensated. But sometimes people also, for example, would be talking about things like, you know, like here is a recent one that I've heard, and it's a real thing. So you probably have heard about concerns about AstraZeneca and Johnson & Johnson vaccine. So literally the last few days, I actually took Johnson & Johnson. And so I literally have heard a statement that basically says that Johnson & Johnson is twice as safe as AstraZeneca, but Pfizer is 12 times as safe as Johnson & Johnson. And apparently in that NPR radio, my podcast, the reason they said that is because Pfizer also had some sort of side effects, but it's approximately 1 for every million. And then AstraZeneca had 12 people per million with blood clots, and then Johnson & Johnson had 6 so far, right? And so they literally looked at those numbers and they said, well, 12 is 2 times as large as 6, so it must be twice as safe. And so, or for example, that one, Pfizer had only 1 case per million, so it must be 12 times as safe. And it makes no sense to talk about it this way. I mean, like, again, like even if you're not medical professional, it just makes no sense. One that drove me crazy, it was this morning. So they said that we had only 1 case of Johnson & Johnson vaccine linked to blood clots in November, but we already had 5 cases this month, and April is not even over. So we see a 5-fold increase. What's going on? And again, yes, it is kind of a 5-fold increase, but I mean, that's out of 1 million people. I mean, like, I'm not sure if you can be talking about these things just like that. So that just makes, you know. Here are some of the recommendations for what to do to preclude R2's criticism. And we kind of talked about that. You know, you explain your variable selection, you say what you wanted to include first, you say what you eventually included, you talk about your measures, you talk about all considerations, controls, and you explain everything as transparently as possible. Same thing with outliers, same thing with hypotheses. But the challenge here is that, again, what do you do if you check it every possible way and it doesn't always come out the way you expect it? So do you just kind of keep it quiet and talk only about the important, the things that support your hypotheses? I'll leave it up to you, but yes, the correct answer would be yes. You should be as transparent as possible, even if it hurts your chances of publication. Easy to say, but you know, unfortunately, the way it's set up, sometimes not so easy to do, especially if you're applying for tenure, and that 1 extra publication could be a difference between getting the permanent contract or not. Now, going back to the effect sizes, so that's what Lance was saying. So this is what I got from medical research. So they have some interesting ways. So one of the possible solutions could be to null hypothesis testing, could be reporting the actual effect size. And so there are different ways to report effect sizes that are more meaningful. Like you report the odds ratio or relative risk or risk difference for medical science. In management, there are also different ways to do it, and I kind of don't like most of them. So here are my recommendations, and I'll give you an example of how to do it in a minute. Like, for example, I would talk, instead of chi-square, I would talk about more specific units. Like, for example, percent change, or maybe, numbers, dollars or people or days difference. You can talk about, for example, difference between an average employee and the best employee, or average company, best company, whatever the measure that you're looking at. You might want to talk about improvements, for example, for every $1,000 invested. Like, for example, if you have tested the effectiveness of the training program, you could say that for every $1,000 that you invest in this program, you get so many dollars back. Percent improvement is a very strong one, return on investment. If you go back to sort of statistical but more meaningful effects, I really like, for example, R squared. So variance explained. So if you say the correlation is 0.2, it doesn't tell you much. But if you say variance explained is If the correlation is 0.2, what's the variance explained? What, how many percent? How many? Correlation is 0.2.
20%.
How many?
20.
20%.
No. Variance explained is correlation squared. So 0.2 times
Oh, okay.
2. So a correlation of 0.2 says that
4%.
4% is explained in that.
4%.
So you say
Yeah.
96% is explained by something else, but 4%. So that's more meaningful. Performance difference between the two conditions. And I would even report the confidence intervals. So I would say that, yes, on average, I expect this many dollars of return on investment for every dollar you invest, but the confidence interval is between this and this. And so that gives you a much more complete picture. Let me show you how I did in that study. You cannot believe how much fighting I had to do with the editor and my co-authors, frankly, who didn't want me to include so-called utility analysis in that paper about the students. So we looked at the predictive power of the university rank and performance. This is the actual result. And the reason I don't like it is because you cannot really interpret that. So you see that everything is significant, right? Almost everything, very strongly significant. So like all of them have 2 asterisks. So it seems like it all works. And so if I stopped here, I would say, yes, university rank predicts performance. It does make some things better and it does make some things worse, as you can see by the sign here. And you can see, I was using like 8 decimals and everything is significant. Yeah, great. But it's not very, not very informative. So then we added a table like this, where it says, the hypothesis was that, universities with higher rank are more selective and that leads to better performance. This is how we tested it. So students from better ranked universities had stronger general skills, stronger, more fluent in more languages. And then we basically said if it was significant or not, and if there were any mediating effects. Then we had this, which again sort of tells you kind of, a story, but the path is negative 0.0004, but it's statistically significant because we had like 40,000 people there. So is it good or not? So eventually this is how I put it in the paper, and it stayed in the paper, it's in the paper. So I said that for every standard deviation improvement in the university rank, the predicted improvement in performance will be 0.12 standard deviations. Still very confusing. But then I said, so what it means is that for every 1,000 position ranks in universities, so we had a webmetrics at that time, they ranked 24,000 universities. So for every 1,000 university ranking positions, you expect performance improvement of 1.9%. And then I even put it, so if you take the best university in our sample, which is University of Toronto, ranked number 17 in the world, versus the very average university rank, ranked 10,041, you would expect 19% improvement in performance. Now, it's statistically significant. Is it enough or not? I mean, someone from a top school versus a very average school ranked 10,000, well, 20% depending on the job, but at least now you know what the magnitude is. So it's more, useful, more interpretable. And then you as a manager decide, okay, is it worth paying extra money to this person from Toronto? Or should I get someone from Riga International School of Economics and Business Administration? So, and maybe save some money because the difference in performance is expected to be 19%. So that's how I thought it would be more meaningful to express it. And the reason I had to fight with my co-authors because they said that, our study sort of shows some results, it's all significant. So when you start putting it this way, the reviewers will start asking additional questions and we don't want to sort of spook them. We don't want to give them something, to criticize. And maybe we should just look at those asterisks and nothing else. Luckily, in the end, it all worked out just fine. Now, another thing that is sometimes, sort of leads to misleading conclusions is causality. And I'll give you a real example and you tell me what's wrong with this. So that was on NPR 2 days ago. So I literally wrote it down. I thought I would use it in class. So a study has found that suicide rates among the veterans in the United States are at all-time high. So there are not only they're high, like higher than at any point in the US history. So more veterans are killing themselves. But now there are more veterans who die of suicide than in combat. And so the story was that we have a epidemic of suicide among veterans, likely because of PTSD, probably because of the recent wars. And so they come back and they have PTSD and maybe not enough support from the government. And so they basically, commit suicides and the government is doing nothing about it. And so presuming that the reviewers checked the study and found nothing wrong with that, so that's the conclusion. I actually did some additional study. I found some criticism, and some of that I suspected was supported. So it seems like it's not true. So why would you, as a reviewer, why would you have a problem with a study like this?
Well, I think the reason that the study came out to be incorrect was that the people that were committing suicide were not the Afghan vets. They were older vets that were committing suicide. So I think they were basically saying that, older Vietnam vets, Korea vets, they were the ones committing suicide and not the more recent ones. So to say, the conclusion they made was what was incorrect. Not the fact that there's an epidemic of suicide, or not that it's an all-time high, but the fact that they linked it to recent wars was incorrect.
Very true. That's a good one. And so apparently they looked at everyone who has ever served in the army, and it's not even Vietnam. I mean, if you did some, National Guard duty 40 years ago, you're still considered a veteran, and so you still would be in the sample. Anything else?
What? Yeah, I mean, what are they comparing? Are we comparing to the Civil War? Did people track suicides after the Civil War?
When we looked at that, so it turns out that suicide rates are at all-time high in general among men. It turns out that the suicide rate is not even the highest among the veterans. Like, for example, it's well below the rate for doctors or lawyers. And so everybody is killing themselves more now than before. We don't know why. It happens to be true for doctors, lawyers, veterans, and so on. And so it has nothing to do with the fact that they're veterans. And when we say that we have more casualties because of suicide and not combat, turns out that we had like 4 people killed in combat last year. So obviously when you have millions of veterans, there will be more of them who committed suicide than there are people dying in combat, just because there are not many people dying in combat these days. And so while the study was correct in all of the numbers, the conclusions, it seems to me, were a little bit messed up in terms of causality. It doesn't seem to be caused by the fact that they're veterans or by the fact that they have PTSD. It's just a trend in the whole population that is also true for veterans, but not because they are veterans. And so obviously here, it seems to me that they were a little sort of, presenting a picture that perhaps is not entirely correct or not fully explained by the numbers that they cited. All right, a couple more things that I wanted to talk about, some of the sources of biases in the data. So I know normally we're done in about an hour, so I need another 10 minutes. So if you need to go, you can watch the recording later, but allow me to take another 10 minutes or so to finish some of the other sources of bias. So when you look at the data, sometimes you can come to erroneous conclusions, and I've rejected quite a few studies myself for the so-called common method bias. So what that is, if all of your data come from the same source, like for example, all of the data come from the same questionnaire, the responses may be affected by some common factors. Like for example, maybe I was, didn't sleep well that night and I was in a bad mood. And so as a result, I was basically answering all questions in a negative way, so to speak. And so in this case, my bad mood affected my answers to each of the questions, representing different constructs. And so as a result, there is a correlation, but it's not because those constructs are correlated, but because the common source or common method bias sort of affected my responses. And you see that very, very often. You often see, in fact, here is my real review. I took a snapshot that I sent on a study that was looking at how cultural intelligence affects performance in cross-cultural situations. But because they didn't really look at presence overseas or performance overseas objectively, but they asked people to self-report, I thought because they reported their own cultural intelligence, they reported their own cultural experiences, they reported their own performance in cross-cultural settings, the data came from the same source. And so I clearly see a threat. But it's not necessarily that the findings are invalid, but I definitely see a threat of common source bias here. And so as a result, I was very suspicious, and I was saying here, as you can see, could you maybe have some more objective measures of performance, for example? Response style differences. Lots of research that shows that different people, based on culture, personality, all kinds of other attributes, may respond differently to the same questions. Again, it's kind of, I'm afraid to claim that now, I didn't test it myself, but there have been quite a few studies that showed, for example, that Americans tend to use what we call an extreme response style. And then people in Asia, for example, tend to choose responses that are sort of closer to the middle. Like, for example, when an American agrees with the question, then an American would choose 5 or 1. or disagrees. So you kind of go more to the extreme in your answer. When a person, let's say, for example, from China, agrees or disagrees with the question, they would choose questions that are closer to the middle. So with the same level of attitude, Americans would choose 1 or 5, whereas Chinese would choose 2 or 4. And so you have very different numbers on the answer scale, but in reality, they do not represent different attitudes or different performances or different behaviors, but merely represent our different tendency to answer those multiple choice questions. Acquiescence bias. Again, studies show that people, for example, in Asia are less likely to say no and more likely to acquiesce. So if the question says, you know, are you happy with your job? They're more likely to say yes or choose an answer that is closer to yes than to no. And again, you can have 2 people from 2 different countries giving you the same point on the scale, but it may not represent, you know, similar attitude. It may represent the different response style, or vice versa. They give you 2 different numbers, but in reality, they have the same attitude. They just respond differently. And then obviously socially desirable responses. You know, people try to make themselves look good in the survey. Like if you ask, so have you ever engaged in HARKing? Or have you ever engaged in, I don't know, trying to find the combination of variables that gives you the best results? I'll say, oh, sure, never, I've never done that. Or maybe, yeah, but not really. And so am I saying the truth, or is it because I'm trying to be sort of, you know, look good in that survey? So sometimes it would have an effect. Self-promotion bias, same thing. So maybe, you know, some people are modest and others are, you know, bragging about their performance. And so the question is, how was your performance last month? Or what is your self-evaluation versus peer evaluations? Some people may just have a very different sort of tendency to self-promote, and as a result, you'll have different responses. This one's very interesting, range restrictions. So you can have truncated range and centered range. Like for example, my kid will be taking SAT next week. And so my kid, I don't think he'll get the maximum score. But let's say somebody is a true genius and could get a much, much higher score if it was allowed. But SATs are limited at 1400, right? So you cannot go above that. Or for example, we actually do a study as we speak on self-evaluation, so self-promotion. And so we wanted to see if people from some cultures are more self-promoting than people from other cultures. The problem is that we use a 5-point scale for peer evaluations. And so I cannot give myself more than a 5. And so if I were like super narcissistic, super egoistic, if I wanted to give myself 1 million, I still cannot do it because there is a limit of 5. And so my range will be restricted and I will not be able to detect some of the effects. Likewise, truncated age. In X culture, for example, if I wanted to see if the readiness test performance predicts performance in X culture, my range would be truncated because nobody who made less than 80 was allowed to participate. It's a small percentage, most people pass the test, but there are still some people who were not allowed to participate in the project because they didn't pass the test. And so as a result, they excluded from the analysis. Or for example, does SAT predict GPA at Harvard? Again, I don't think anybody gets to Harvard unless they have like the 95th percentile in SATs. And so you only have that little, you know, top range. And so you don't have the full range. And so as a result, it's impossible to reliably test that, right? Sampling bias, self-selection bias happens all the time. Like for example, if you ask students to stay after school to complete the assignment and you want to study conscientiousness, well, obviously only conscientious students would stay after school. So you have a self-selection bias. Convenience sampling, like when you use students to predict manager behavior, for example, right? Or if you use students who are, or use your friends to conduct the study, but maybe all your friends are different from the general population. So that's, you know, that convenience sampling may not generalize to the full population. Non-response bias. I told you about a study conducted in Ukraine last year. They wanted to see if, 2 years ago, they wanted to see if there is any sexual harassment going on Ukrainian college campuses. And so they put the mailboxes all around colleges asking people to report cases. And there was zero response, like nobody, not a single case reported, from which they concluded that there is no sexual harassment on Ukrainian college campuses, whereas there are a lot of them in the United States. So maybe the United States should learn from Ukrainian academics how to eliminate sexual harassment on campus. But I mean, obviously I can see a threat of non-response bias. It's not that there is nothing, it's just people just didn't report it, right? So, and then some more complicated things, like for example, cross-sectional data to study longitudinal change. I talked about my dissertation where I was trying to see how fast people acculturate, but I didn't have 25 years to track the same sample of people. So I compared acculturation levels in people who just arrived in Canada, have been there for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 25 years. And so I hope it was fine. But I mean, technically it was not a longitudinal change. It was just a change, across different cohorts. What if people who came to Canada 25 years ago were different people than those who come today, which is possible. And maybe those are the reason for the differences rather than because time has passed. Likewise, sometimes we use simulation. Yes.
Sorry. So I know you're trying to jam this out, but this stuff is really fascinating. So the range bias that you did 2 slides ago. So so this is important, right? Because you don't want a ceiling effect, nor do you want a floor effect, right? So if you're trying to, whatever, you're going to do a 7-point scale on job satisfaction, and you want to implement some sort of program to see if it improves job satisfaction, right? Well, you would want to exclude the people that are already to 7 before the study even starts, right? Because you can't possibly improve their job satisfaction.
That's a good point. Yeah. I mean, if somebody's so happy and the program cannot make them any happier, that's true. And again, the challenge here is that it's different in different studies. Like this one is a very interesting case that you said. If you want to see if this program will improve job satisfaction, and somebody scores at a maximum in the beginning, maybe they don't even qualify for the study. Maybe you want to only look at people below a certain point. That's a very good. So maybe in this case, you actually want to actively restrict the range. So, and in this case, maybe, yeah, I never thought about that. I should include that example because, yeah, it looks like you always want to have the full range, but sometimes maybe you want to have only the bottom or the top people, right? Or maybe if you want to see if the, lower salary will make people less happy. Well, if there is somebody who's already completely dissatisfied, like there is no way they will go down in their scores. So maybe you want to look only at those who are currently happy. Yeah.
Since we're on the topic, I know I'll have this problem with some things, but if you have a scale, 1 to 5, 1 to 7, but the 1s and 2s really don't get used, or it's really like it's an active 3 to 7 kind of scale. How would you work through?
I wouldn't worry too much about that part, because if nobody goes into that tail, I guess, that's fine. And I suppose we still have some submissions. Let's say if you're looking at the quality of the report that may get a 1, so that's okay. I would be more worried about the range restriction at 7 censoring. So because if somebody did like a world-class, report that deserves a 10, and we just cannot give a 10, so that report will be counted just like a regular 7, just a simply good report. And so in this case, you will you might want to know why there was someone who produced that genius report, what made them so special. But in your data set, they don't even look special. They just look a 7. And so that's the range that is truncated, I would be more concerned about it.
Okay, thanks.
So sometimes people use simulations to collect data. Like for example, I've seen so many studies on cultural effects where they would ask students to sit in different parts of the room and pretend to be in China, in the United States. Sometimes they study, for example, the effects of the online communication technology or different languages, and the software would deliberately either delay the message or change some words randomly to kind of pretend that we are talking, like I'm speaking with an accent and you cannot understand me. And so I suspect it should be okay in most of the cases, but I can imagine that at least sometimes that simulated cultural difference or language difference or time zone difference cannot be quite the same as the real differences. Different incentives, again, in fact, that's a problem sometimes in X-culture. So if we wanted to study how different things affect performance, well, there is a difference between students who do it for a credit for the course versus employees for whom that's the job, that's their livelihood. And so in X-culture, we try to provide serious incentives more than just a little bonus. But again, is it still the same? Like, would I perform the same way if it were my real job? So we don't know. Many studies look at priming, like for example, if they wanted to study the effects of mood or the effects of individualism, collectivism, on whatever, they would ask you to read some words, like for individualism, collectivism, usually they would give you like a passage where you have a lot of I, me, and my for one condition, we, us, and our for the other condition. And presumably that will put you in the collectivist or individualist state of mind. Does it really work? I don't know. I mean, so here it's a little bit, sometimes they give you like some puzzle to solve, and again, you have the words that are positive or negative, and presumably that gives you some. Anyway, here is a very useful table that I found, and you have a whole study that talks about how to report your study limitations. So one thing you should probably do is honestly and openly report and talk about the limitations of your study. And so you can report the limitations just as limitations, or as I do it, I always combine the limitations in future research sections. And I talk honestly about the problems with my study, but I present it as, and this is an opportunity for future research. My sample was small, it's a problem, but I hope future researchers will retest it, replicate it in a larger sample. I had only students, it's a limitation. I call future researchers to try to do the same study using organizational employees. And so you have here like literally some wording that you can use from real studies to address each kind of limitation of your study. And finally, I want to conclude with the real story from today. I completed a review and I still feel kind of ambivalent, not ambivalent, well, kind of, you know, two-way about it. And so the study, in fact, let me show you the real comments that I left a few hours ago. So let's see if it's still open. Yeah, you can see it, right? So this was at the journal Human Resource Management Journal, one of the top journals. And the paper looked, well, here's what I said to the reviewer. So confidential comments to the editor and then comments to the author are much longer. So in the confidential comments to the editor, I said basically flawless execution, marginal contribution. I said the study is done perfectly. I have no concerns. I say if you think that it's significant enough as a you know topic, publish it as is. Like I would not ask for any changes. I think they've done a great job. They had study 1, study 2, they had multiple samples, they've done all the tests. But I find it to be so trivial, so primitive, or so obvious that I cannot imagine anyone ever reading the study saying, aha, yeah, I didn't know that. And so, I don't know. I mean, sometimes reviewer 2, as I guess in this case, is just not a happy reviewer. So the study looked at something like this. They basically said if team members communicate less, they feel more isolated. And if team members communicate less, they have problems with coordination. That's basically the study. The model is slightly more complicated, but essentially, if you communicate daily, and if you work from home versus from office, you know, that affects your perceived isolation. And if you perceive to be isolated, eventually it leads to problems with coordination. So essentially they say if you communicate more, you have fewer problems with coordination. If you communicate less, you have more problems with coordination. And so I said the study is perfect. I just don't think this is interesting. I mean, I thought, you know, that's kind of obvious. Yes, if we communicate more, obviously we will feel less isolated. I looked also at the specific questions they ask, and they're kind of similar questions, you know, like isolation is really measured more like, you know, do you feel like you're not communicating enough with your team members? Well, you know, obviously that's, you know, like all this relationship here. Everything is common source bias, and you know, all come from the same source. And so I don't know. I mean, I feel still a little guilty in the review here. Where is it? I did say that either publish as is, or and don't torture them because there is not much they can change. But then I personally, so I recommended major revisions just because there is no option for something like this. But I said I personally feel 50-50. I'd probably recommend a publication. It's a good study, but I do not expect that the study will generate many citations. And so, I don't know, I mean, sometimes I do see these studies that I feel like are a little bit, you know, sort of, you know, trying to prove the obvious. And as a result, I sometimes feel like, I don't know, as a reviewer, I'm not excited about them. And so, I don't know. What would you do in this case? What would be your recommendation for a study like this?
Did they control for any history of like learned helplessness in the team or work trauma or conflict?
No, I don't think they did. It's an interesting one, and maybe that would have made it more interesting. So that's a good one. And I'm glad that you focused on that helplessness. You know, maybe that's the interesting stuff. But in the abstract and in the discussion, they only talk about, you know, the more you communicate, the fewer problems you have down the road. And the problems, coordination problems, not performance better. But yeah, so I don't know.
Did they do anything?
I'm sorry. I was just going to say, usually there's a reason why you stop communicating. It's not that you just stop communicating.
That's an interesting, yeah, I guess if you looked at that, and in fact, you know, Karen knows that in X culture, we have a lot of problems with people stopping communicating. So that would be an interesting one. So, but in this particular case, no, they didn't go that deep. And so it just felt to me that all they said, it's interesting in a sense that, you know, somebody has to test that as well. But by the way, I don't know who the authors are, and if this video gets out and the authors are watching it, so, well, I'm honestly telling you here what I said about this study, and I kind of stand by my evaluation. Great study, but kind of obvious in a sense. So my apology that I did not recommend accept, but anyway, so I think in this case,
Well, you are actually kind of recommending publication here.
well, you know, yeah. So it just, as I said, you know, I don't know what to say.
Well, it could be, you
Was
know,
it-
if what they're saying is that is communication is, you know, if you send an email once a day, that's communicating.
Yeah.
But, you know, if that's sufficient versus being in face-to-face with somebody.
What I mean here is that you will encounter from time to time studies as a reviewer, but maybe you'll also write some studies that seem to sort of prove, you know, something that is almost expected and obvious. Like here is another like real comment that I made. I found this one's from about a year ago. So they had a common source, but also, so it was about basically, you know, people who, it was all self-report. And so people who say that their colleagues in their department like working with one another also say that they feel their colleagues work well with them, and also say those who know more share more information with those who know less. And so it just seemed to me like, you know, I don't know, this is not only so expected, but the way they measured each of those constructs was virtually, you know, the same question. And yes, they found the correlations, but I just didn't find that to be particularly compelling or discovering, so to speak. And so I'm not sure what the recommendation in that study was, but I just felt that in this case, they essentially said that those who say that I like, I don't know, ice cream also say that I like sweet things. And so, yeah, I guess true, but I mean, so what? I mean, did you expect that they would say something else? So I don't know. Anyway, that's all I wanted to say for today. I'm going to stop here. So hopefully that was useful. I'll post the slides and the recording for those who couldn't stay till the end. Yeah, any comments or questions? Sorry, it took me a little longer today.
I'd like to say one thing. There are several of us who are interested in your article about the university, the students and universities, and it's not in the UNCG library or mine. So if you can send
Actually,
it to
I
us.
think I added it to readings today. So yes, I was trying to, because I included that paper in your readings, I think, as an example. And let me see here. I was trying to see if I have the latest example, the latest version of the paper, and I think I didn't. And so I only have, let me edit right here. So I only had my own version in Microsoft Word. And so it seems like it's still not out fully. So
You did put it in Canvas. I see it. It starts with EJIM_university rankings.
Yeah, so, and I'll just put it here as well. So it's in your readings, you have the link to this one. So again, it's not the most revolutionary paper or anything like that. So it's just the one that I kind of struggled more than with others to publish it because of the theory, because of the sort of effects that are not super strong where you can say one way or the other. And so as a result, it makes a good example for some of these things that we discuss in the course. All right,
Can you
well,
talk a little bit more about what you expect for the final paper? I know that you'll probably talk about it next time, but time's moving.
so the final paper should contain only the research question. So as the minimum to get an A+ or 100% for the paper, as long as it contains a clearly stated research question, a clearly stated hypothesis, and then a description of what kind of data you will use, what kind of measures you will use, and what kind of analysis you will do. That's all you need. I encourage you to do more. And in fact, most of you already have some sort of an introduction. Great, I'll read that and comment on that. Many of you have not just a research question, but have multiple research questions and multiple hypotheses. That's fine as well. Many of you I see have very detailed descriptions of your samples. You already have the data. Great, describe that in as much detail as possible if you have the data. And then some of you even included the actual results. We had about probably like a third of you already had some results. It looks like you had the data and you ran the analysis. So the more you include, the better, in a sense that I will be able to comment on all of that. And so if you would like to get my feedback and suggestions, then I'll be able to say more if I see more. But just simply to get the full grade for the paper, I need only the research question, hypothesis, data description, variables essentially, and method. It would be nice also, I think, in the discussion it says that you also want to include a few words on what the results might look like. And it's not the numbers, but basically you would say something that what you expect to see, so to speak, or what kind of data you will look at in the results section. Like, for example, I will evaluate, I don't know, correlations or beta coefficients, or, and if they are such and such, it means something. Not much, just a couple of lines just to make sure that I understand what, what statistics you will be looking at. And then if you want to add also limitations, I think we also have that, talk about that as well a little bit. Like, for example, if you know that you will be using students in the class that you teach, you might want to say a few words about, maybe a threat to generalizability of your findings. If you will be using, for example, archival data, and you know that they are limited to one country, or maybe only to 1 year, and you believe that maybe, that's a problem, again, maybe in different countries, it would be a different effect. You might want to say something about those limitations. But technically it could be any of your weekly submissions or whatever the frequency was. So any of those submissions, maybe with a little bit more details in it, but not much more. And again, importantly, even though each of the individual submissions was on a different method. So we talked about hypothesis first, then we had the differences, correlations, moderation, mediation, all those additional methods. You choose only one. So unless it's a bigger study and you do all of those, but otherwise choose which one is most appropriate, and that's all we need. Like if it's in the end only the OLS regression with moderation, that's fine. Don't need to mention HLM, SEM, logit, probit, whatever else we talked about. Or if it's logistical regression, no need to mention the other ones. So the goal here is, in the ideal world, it would be something that will become the methods section of your dissertation. The theory and methods, but theory only the hypothesis, not the actual explanation of the theory. Realistically, I know that many of you are still not sure what the dissertation will be about. Then maybe it would be a paper that at some point you want to expand and publish. But if it's something that is just for this class, that's perfectly fine as well. No problem at all. How many of you do have a dissertation topic? Like, you know what you want to do for your dissertation? Raise your hand. Do we have several people at least? So Karen?
Raise a hand, like we sort of know.
Okay, yeah.
Will you tell us, will you be honest with us if you think that we have one of those kind of like, so what sort of ideas?
Well, as I was saying, one, dissertation is just a study. Like, it doesn't have to be a world-changing study. So in any of those proposals that I've seen, you can expand that into a dissertation. Like every single one I've seen, if you sort of add enough meat to it, if you kind of collect good data, all of those are good enough questions, and with proper execution can be good enough dissertations, publishable papers. So some of you were changing the topic for each of the submissions, and that's even better because you have more to choose from. That's not a problem. If I'll have some problems with you in terms of, like, so what or what to do, yeah, I'll try to be honest with that. It will not affect your grade. Like, if I find it boring, but it's still a good explanation for this course, it's fine. It's not like you're trying to, publish a paper that will generate a lot of citations, as long as the method is fine. So I'll try to be, say that, yeah, I don't think that will work. Like, for example, several of you we met on the phone, 4 or 5 of you, I spoke several times. And so with some of the students, we kind of saw that maybe, you know what, in the available time, it might not work. Great study, but we don't have enough, for example, time to collect the data, or the time frame is not wide enough to, to look at the change over that time. So we were like, yeah, I mean, it should be fine. If you want to describe that as a study, that's fine. But if you wanted to submit it to a journal, unless you get lucky and you'll see a change in that within that time frame. If not, any reviewer will say, well, of course you only had a few weeks. I mean, why would you see the change so fast? So hopefully I'll be able, if it's a study that probably doesn't have any, future, maybe I'll be able to warn you in advance so you don't waste your time on it. But at the same time, as I said, it's usually more about execution than the actual idea. I mean, as long as the idea is good enough, it all boils down to can you get good data? Can you do the right analysis? So, yeah. And some of your studies are really, really interesting. Like some of them, I think they can be, like a whole career path. Like, I don't remember the names now, but I remember there is this one on working from home, how that isolates you, like kind of similar to what these guys were saying here. So I think, especially now with COVID, that so many people work from home, I mean, this is wonderful. This is great. I like that one where the media coverage of the company affects stock prices and company valuations. Again, big stuff. I mean, this is, you know, like, you probably can write books and books on that topic. Can you find the data? I mean, this will be, I mean, you can, but it will probably take a lot of time, you know, just scouting the web for the news articles for the specific period of time. But again, that would be a great study. So Karen is doing some things around X-culture. I know that will be, you know, if done right, it will be publishable. So lots of good ideas, but you know, now the question is, will you collect the data in time? Will you get it, you know, done in time? There are a few almost, you know, abnormally productive people in the next cohort. Like there are a few people, like there is this one student who submitted paper 3 now, I believe. Like, I mean, she just like every two weeks, she comes back with a paper. We got some, you know, like, I don't know, like my job, I barely, you know, keep up with reading the paper and providing comments. There is another professor involved, so she's probably doing more, but I mean, I don't know how she does it. Like, I've never been even close to that. So, but I don't know, maybe you just have some outliers there. So, or I don't know, or just people on what is it, on the
on the other side, on the flip side of that, if I could ask a question about something that's due tomorrow. So we all have to, by tomorrow, submit our first and second areas. Am I right on that, folks?
Is it tomorrow? Let me take a look here.
I believe it's tomorrow, the 15th.
Look at this.
So for those of us who are waiting till that last moment, actually was chatting with some folks. A lot of us are doing OB, and a lot of us are really kind of, you know, really thoroughly enjoying both the strategy and IB. And so, you know, in terms of, do you have any advice or thoughts about how do you pick a secondary area if, you know,
this one is trickiest. So technically my own, when I was doing my PhD, my main area was management, kind of with the interest in international management, but my minor was strategy. And so for a while I wasn't sure which one I want to do. So I think it probably doesn't really matter that much. It's good to have a minor and a major, so to speak, because when you will be applying for jobs, if, you know, most of you already have jobs, but it may be good to signal that you can teach multiple subjects, because, you know, the department may have a need to teach multiple subjects. And if you say, I can teach international business, but I can also teach strategy, and if needed, I can teach management, it may make you more attractive to them. At the same time, when it comes to research, you probably want to develop a research stream that looks at something very narrow. So this way, you will first be known for that specific topic. But second, you can recycle a lot of stuff. Like if you do the same type of studies over and over again, you know, the literature, you can quickly write, you know, the introduction, the literature review, you have the, you know, all the references. You can probably write multiple papers from the same data set, looking at slightly different, you know, aspects. So you probably will be more productive if you kind of select your niche. And, you know, but then again, most of us publish in sort of multiple areas. Sometimes people come and offer you, you know, to work together. So I don't know, especially in our case, since we are multidisciplinary, you know, a department. So I think, yeah.
That's a really good point, though, about teaching, especially for those of us who are kind of hoping to stay with our current university. So kind of looking at where they might have the need or what you're most interested in teaching.
We hired a bunch of people over the last few years, including to teach in your program here. And we had sort of an interesting situation where on the one hand, many people were rejected because they were sort of wrong area. We had, for example, we needed to hire some people who are OB, like for example, Aisha was more OB. And then we needed also some people who are more HR. And so we hired, like, for example, I think it was Jason who was more HR. And so it was interesting that we had in both cases strong applicants from these two very sort of overlapping fields. And the dean was saying, no, we cannot hire this person because he's more OB and we need someone HR. And we were like, who cares? I mean, they can teach the same subject, they do good research. And the dean was saying no because of that small difference. But when the discussion was going on in the department, whom we recommend, every single time the issue comes up, okay, well, we need someone to teach this course, but it's possible that tomorrow the person will also need to teach IB, for example. So has this person taught IB? Oh yeah, okay, actually, you know what, that might be, you know, might come in handy because Vas was teaching IB, but now he will be teaching in the PhD program. So we need someone here. So maybe we should hire, because who knows? So in a sense that kind of helps here because, you know, so I don't know. You don't want to make it too diverse, like you don't want to be marketing and strategy, for example. So that's probably too wide. But strategy and management or international business and management, definitely not a bad combination. Yeah.
Very helpful. Thanks.
So the paper is due on the 18th. And this one, let me share this screen again. So this one will be a probability of the outcome or group membership, or basically any of those topics that we discussed last time. You can choose any one of them, and it's only one. And then the final will be due on May the 2nd. And so for the final one, you can choose literally any of those papers, individual papers that you did, maybe just expand it a little bit more. Most of you were working on the same topic, like most of you, as I expected or recommended, every time you were looking at the same setting, the same problem, just kind of slightly different angle. And so if so, you can keep it all together or just select the most interesting aspect of it. But if you were looking at a different study each time, just select one of them. And it can be something as simple as, you know, is there a difference or association? Maybe add moderator and mediator if you need, but you know, if you want to use one of these more sophisticated methods, that's all you need. And so it would be basically one of those papers with a little bit more substance to it. So,
also, if we have another paper that we worked on for another class, we wanted to update it a little bit more, can we use it for this class as well?
yes, as I said, again, my philosophy here is, I don't know, maybe some professors have a different philosophy. My sort of, you know, recommendation, and that's how I did it in my own PhD program. So ideally, I would like you to work on the same study for the whole 4 years. And so it would be the same study for every class. It will then become your dissertation. It will then become a bunch of papers that you publish. So I don't see a problem at all if you wrote a paper, for example, for, I don't know, for your, let's say, Rika's strategy class. And then you use in my course, and now you talk about the methods. And even if you used it for Aaron's class, which is also methods, I know there it was all about the numbers. So there it was all about the analysis. Here it's more about the research design. Hopefully you will improve the research design. You will add some more things. So I think that would be not only more efficient, but that's the right way to do it. Like, we don't want you to end up with 8 papers that are 20% finished. We want you to end up with one paper that is 100% finished and maybe has a few additional kind of offshoots that you can develop into new papers. So I have absolutely no problem. In fact, I encourage you to take something that you prepared for my own course when you took the strategy, or for any other theory courses. I mean, when you took the theory course, or whatever you prepared for other theory or methods courses, because again, that will allow you to do more, and it will allow me to provide better feedback. And hopefully then next year we will see the draft of your dissertation based on that work. So no problem of that kind.
Thank you.
Yeah. And I encourage you, again, I don't know what the other professors told you. I'll say you that, but I'm pretty much sure that everybody thinks that way. So this course will be over in 2 weeks. But you will continue working on your dissertation for another year or two, whatever time it will take. So if you ever have any questions about, for example, either methods or AB theory, do come back to me. I'll always be available. And I'm pretty sure the other professors as well. And so our sort of, you know, intrinsic interest here is that, you know, we work with you now, but then eventually maybe we'll publish something together, or maybe you'll become tomorrow's reviewer too. And in fact, it's very likely that you will be reviewing some of my papers 10 years from or 5 years from now. So therefore, you know, we want to work together because, you know, we do get something out of this as well. So therefore, yeah, so if let's say you submit something that is just enough to pass the course, but then half a year later you work over the summer and you have a much more extended draft, do send it to me. I'll be happy to take a look and provide feedback. And as I said, maybe eventually we'll even publish something together based on that. So no problem at all. So, in fact, I published probably my 10 first papers all in co-authorship with my supervisors. And so that was, you know, they were teaching a course, and then eventually it led to all kinds of things. So hopefully that will be the same thing here. All right, well, it took us much longer today. So good luck, good night, and I'll see you in 2 weeks.
Thank you.
Awesome.
Thanks. Bye-bye.